Having spent several episodes enthusing about Dorset and all things Hillforts, we are now getting moving to other nearby counties. Now, the South Downs is a vast chalk ridgeline that snakes all the way along the south coast from Hampshire into Sussex, with a series of surprisingly diverse enclosures to explore. However, we're going to need a little bit of a run-up just before we get to the start line of the South Downs by beginning further south in West Hampshire. Now, we're going to attempt to cover pretty much the entire UK in this series, though some areas are going to prove considerably more fruitful than others when it comes to clearly visible Iron Age sites. So it's perhaps a bit of a puzzle that while Dorset has some of the finest examples in the country, Southwest Hampshire, and particularly the New Forest region directly next door, is kind of slim pickings by comparison. Remember, the modern boundary of Dorset comports loosely, or even in various places directly, to the territory of the Durotriges. Now, we'll not talk about survival bias right now, but I'm going to stick out my neck that there aren't any maiden castle scale enclosures here that just happen to have been ploughed flat in the intervening 2 millennia. Martin Papworth in his book points out that while the good farmland on places like Chalk, for example, were prized in the Iron Age, the moorland with a mixture of gravel, clay and peat in the New Forest is pretty poor for agriculture, and so he characterises the lull in activity and sites you find as you head east into the New Forest area as a possible buffer zone between the land west of the Avon that would become the territory of the Durotriges and the land east which would come to be controlled by the Belgae. However, the talk of late Iron Age tribes is going to have to wait a bit. If you've caught this series so far, you may know why. We'll get to it. But back to the New Forest. It's not that there's nothing here. You occasionally come across Bronze Age sites, though compared with Dartmoor or Bodmin Moor, which are geographically not dissimilar, it's pretty sparse for ancient places. The Setley Plain disc barriers you're seeing are easily the most impressive still visible in the landscape, but not all that far northeast of Bournemouth, just a bit above the village of Burley. Castle Hill certainly makes for a nice view on a summer's evening. If you take the motorway exit around McDonald's and on the main road there, you can be parked up in a couple of minutes and walking along the ridge. However, while the ditches are not insubstantial, the site is covered with trees, hence my ability to photograph it well is limited. Here's a ditch, if you can make it out amongst all the foliage. If there has been any archaeological work done here, I've not found any mention of it. If you then head directly north, and if you can just momentarily stop chuckling at the Sandy Balls holiday camp, in the woods out to the north is Frankenberry Camp. The reason for a fort here is not hugely obvious until you see the drop off to the west and the commanding views over the Avon. It's about level with where the town of Fordingbridge is now. It's something you'll see frequently in this series. A fort that is ringed by trees that, while yes, they mark out the outline of the enclosure very well, they also obscure the ditches beneath them, leaving you with a less than especially compelling shot from ground level. Again, no major archaeology appears to have been done there. As I said, the New Forest does not boast the finest hill forts you'll find anywhere. There are others, but these are pretty slight or so tree-buried as to be functionally invisible to all but LiDAR. We have to draw the line somewhere, and it might as well be places we can actually film and show you in a meaningful way. It's not to say there wasn't Iron Age occupation here. There's a little prehistory housed in the Lyndhurst Museum, and we also have coin hoards and finds like these, which you can find in the Lymington Museum. And yeah, perhaps the most noteworthy in the entire New Forest area is down in the southeast near the coast, just above the town of Lymington. Buckland Rings is partly buried beneath trees, but its form emerges at various points. It's particularly nice in autumn when these were taken, and the scale of the ramparts is considerable. It's a fairly square enclosure with an interned entrance facing east. In fact, its square shape led it to be labelled as a Roman fort until more investigation was done in the late 1800s by the Hampshire Archaeological Society. There was a dig here in 1935 by Christopher Hawkes. Finds were not especially plentiful, and while he suggested a 1st century BC construction, that now seems unlikely. Okay, well, most of the New Forest accounted for. There is a faint enclosure just across the water on the Isle of Wight. Just above Mottistone and the standing stone from which it derives its name, you can probably just make out this square enclosure under the heather. The Hampshire Archaeological Society have a paper on it. It was probably a livestock enclosure, dating not certain. Apparently the storm of 87 left it pretty damaged due to trees coming down, and also the process of taking them away didn't do it any favours either. The Isle of Wight does have some pretty impressive barrow cemeteries, particularly along the spine of its southwestern coast, but Hillforts distinctly less so. So pardon us if it doesn't get much more than a brief mention in these episodes. Now, so far, none of these are showstoppers. I can just feel the YouTube engagement dropping as I'm typing all of this. If you're still here, well done. But as a reward for waiting, we're picking up the trail of far more substantial forts, and apart from anything else, these have a lot more to see for the casual visitor. So first off, just to the south of what is now Winchester, St. Catherine's Hill. We got to see this right at the height of midsummer when the sun is rising about 5 a.m. Whether you realise this or not, you actually see this every time you drive north on the M3. There had been a settlement on the hill from some time between 550 to 450 BC, but the ramparts came later, around 250 to 200 BC. It had timber defences and alterations were made to the gate, but the site appears to have fallen out of use by around 50 BC. But the area was not completely abandoned. Despite its impressive appearance, St. Catherine's Hill was not to be the only, nor the most significant Iron Age settlement in the area. When the Romans founded Venta Belgarum, what would later become Winchester, they did so in the area of what had been an oppidum. This settlement was the capital of the Belgae in the area. Not much to see of this now, given the town the Romans built atop it would become one of the most significant in the south of Britain, and the medieval town was not exactly messing around either. But since Winchester is frequently given as the start of the South Downs, now let's throw up that title card. That's right, all of that was just a cold open, sort of, as if it matters. If we follow the line of the ridge to the east, a site that's pretty remote, and I don't hear spoken about all that frequently, but an incredibly beautiful spot, you'll find that Hillforts don't get the most original names ever. There's another much more famous Beacon Hill, not even all that far to the north of here, but as for Beacon Hill Warnford, it sits at the end of a prominent chalk spur, a roughly circular enclosure with some barrows visible. Here's the thing, and don't all act shocked at once, not every bump and dip in the English countryside gets its own paperback book published. So somewhere like Megalithic Portal is a phenomenal resource on the prehistoric, but in researching these episodes, I do sometimes come up a bit dry. So I filmed this on a lovely winter's day, and look, there's no shortage of Hillforts that are winning at hide and seek for the 2000th year in a row, so I was thrilled seeing this, yeah, there it is, Beacon Hillfort. Is it though? I've found references to this being a barrow cemetery, so we have Neolithic and Bronze Age use on the site. And I mean, the ditch looks clear as day. It occupies a spur on the end of the hill. It definitely seems like the sort of thing you would do. But on looking into it further, when it comes to making all these, I'm still finding my way. I'm still doing a lot of reading as we go, and it seems I was just wrong about this being a hill fort, despite how it looks. If I've understood correctly, there's mention of medieval trackways, which I think is what you're seeing here, this bit on the north side. I mean, I really thought these were Iron Age. It looks the part, but turns out probably not. So there you go. Anyway, while it's not the easiest to spot in the distance, is our next site. This is Old Winchester Hill. We included this in our list of underrated sites in the UK, which you could flick on after this. In fact, we've garnered quite the groundswell of people in these last couple of episodes, which is wonderful. Not long ago, when we were still primarily doing travel episodes with their focus on ancient sites, we were trying to find our people, but well, this platform invariably just left us to kick rocks. So it's really exciting to have a bunch of you along who are passionate about hill forts and ancient Britain, or who are just curious. We always try and make sure that even if we are getting into the weeds of historical detail, that this is accessible to a wider audience, and one of the main ways we do that, it's always been important to us to actually get out and see these places and photograph them. There's enough channels out there making history episodes with stock video assets or a few grainy JPEGs, but we've always been determined, as far as we can, to actually go and film as many of these sites as we can. Which is why these episodes have taken so long. We started filming Hillforts around 6 years ago now, and very clearly we're still at it. As for everything else we're going for, I mean, wind forward another 6 years, it'll be a near miracle if we've made around all the Roman sites we have on the list, whether it's in Europe, to Anatolia, into Arabia and Africa. For now, there's a lot more you can catch on the channel, just picking one at random. The Greek island of Naxos is phenomenal, like so much to see and love, and of course some incredible history and prehistory there. And yet this platform decided to show that to pretty much one metric nobody. So why not queue that up for next, or close to home, perhaps our episode on Orkney with all its Neolithic sites, but also Iron Age Brocks and Souterrains, these underground passages. There's all sorts. We'd love to have you subscribe, and you probably know all the YouTube things you can do to be nice, but honestly, I just get the happiest when people actually just see what we've done and flick through some of our other episodes, so just go right ahead. Anyway, back to Old Winchester Hill, and the incongruity of the hill fort directly above Winchester not getting the title of Old Winchester Hill is quite amusing to me. Old Winchester Hill really is an incredible place to be. It's a fantastic walk with some of the best views you'll get in this western end of the South Downs. Other than the ramparts, there's quite a few features to unpack here too. For example, you can't exactly miss these. This Bronze Age barrow cemetery predates the later Iron Age fort, and it's something we've described a bunch already. The Iron Age hill fort enclosures are not infrequently being constructed around sites, particularly high points with either barrows and other landmarks like causewayed enclosures dating back to the Bronze Age and even further back to the Neolithic. Somewhat less obvious, there's a feature here described as a dew pond. It might not be the mightiest of reservoirs now, but it's just one answer to the multiple choice question that hangs over many hill forts of, so where's the water coming from? This recreation from the info board suggests fairly dense habitation. According to Historic England, the simple design of the ramparts suggests an early Iron Age date from around 550 to maybe 400 BC, and it may have largely fallen out of use by about 100 BC. And yeah, there's a major oppidum where the town of Winchester is now. That certainly fits with the same sort of pattern we saw in Dorset. We took quite some time explaining this process. It's still a little mysterious why major hill forts are being constructed in the early to mid Iron Ages, and just as suddenly these power centres appear to be falling out of use in 100 BC. Not just piecemeal, it varied place to place, but it's a major shift in the landscape and in how society was organised. I want to insert a section here on the late Iron Age tribes in the area whose names have come down to us, but there's so many caveats. How could there not be caveats? So I think that's going to have to be next episode's job. Moving along to the east, and while this division has no meaning in the Iron Age context, this just gets us over the line into West Sussex. Now you can see here this gorgeous sundown across the South Downs. I managed to pick an amazing day to get out here, and here is Harting Beacon. Or rather, it would have been, but this most lovely West Sussex evening I messed up. You see, Harting Beacon is quite slight as a hill fort, and so, not seeing it clearly in the landscape, I was under the impression it was over here in this area that appears to be ringed with trees, as opposed to over there where it actually is. So instead of getting loads of footage baked in late summer sun, I had to come back on a grey day where it's far less inspiring. You can see the banks a bit better now, okay, yeah, there's something there. The ramparts are perhaps not most obvious in the southeastern corner. Generally, modern ploughing has reduced their height, dating to around 700 BC. We identified what would have been a timber gateway at the causewayed entrance in the western ramparts, and within sight of Harting Beacon, despite the fact we're generally heading in an easterly direction, if we just backpedal a moment to the north and west, we have Torbury Hill. It's somewhat masked by trees and not especially well known about, but you can just about see its form from above. I actually didn't know this was here, but while on Harting Down enjoying the evening, I spied this hill rising above the village, and with what looked like telltale ditches, and sure enough, it was in use in the early Iron Age, with the ramparts being expanded to enclose the top of the spur. So excavations in 1948 and then in 1956 revealed different phases. Between the 5 to 300s BC, this is essentially a promontory fort, but during the 300s the ramparts were expanded to encircle the whole hilltop. The gate was modified sometime between 2 to 100 BC, but from 100 BC the site falls largely out of use and the gate was destroyed. Now, at this point, we're pretty close to Chichester. This was my hometown of around 20 years, and the Roman history of Chichester is fairly well known, but the settlement that was here before the Roman civitas, much less so. Thing is, what's much harder to show you in these episodes, so hill forts are these unusually prominent sites where at least a footprint of Iron Age life endures in the British landscape. What is not particularly available for us to see as casual enthusiasts are all the lowland settlements that didn't have a major ditch and bank around them, and these are the missing piece to the story. In fact, just from personal experience, I recall the first time I was going to the Winchester City Museum or the Salisbury Museum or the Wiltshire Museum, and I was like, all right, time to see all those finds from these Hillforts I've been visiting. Let's go. And in actuality, while I would sometimes see a name I recognised on one of the description cards, like, oh, yep, been there, most of the finds in these places are from places I'd never heard of and were, just various digs from the last 150 odd years. And in modern times, these are often now just farmland or a place that just otherwise looks like a blank patch of grass, or maybe it's a shopping centre now. The Oppidum at Chichester, I can just about show. Well, okay, this isn't going to change your life, but for example, this woodland is called Brandy Hole Lane. By the way, this was like our woods when I was growing up. We'd be here all the time. When I go there now, it's comically small. When you're a kid, you think these places are vast, and it's actually barely a 5-minute stroll end to end. Anyway, pardon me if I try and balance the harsh highlights and strong shadows on what was a particularly sunny day, but this isn't just a sunken lane. The bank you're seeing here is actually part of the Chichester entrenchments. Now, we had a conversation with Miles Russell last episode, who did an amazing job of describing these structures that are on the boundary of Oppida. They are tricky to get your head around because at first it's like, yeah, cool, ditches and banks, Hillfort stuff, great. But it's not quite as straightforward as that. Cutting to a diagram of the structures that we know about around Chichester, for example, it's like, well, that's no good. It's got holes in it. And if I go a little further out a second, this kink in the line is another part of the entrenchments. Chichester is a small place, and I thought I knew it pretty well. I had not a clue this was out here. Now, you can just about see the banks, though nowadays, yes, quite tree-covered. But if we pan up a second, Chichester, or at least the modern town of, is there way off in the distance. You can see how this makes no sense in Hillfort terms. Like, what are you going to do? Make a fort that's 20 miles across? Like, come on, be serious. So yes, it'll be much better to hear it in his own words, so do go back and listen to the last episode if you haven't yet. But Miles described these in terms of a frontier, a boundary. It's been particularly observed that these boundary structures are much more stopping a mass movement of, for example, chariots than maybe a few individuals on foot. So he described them a bit like anti-tank defences, and interestingly, there are in fact some World War II anti-tank defences still in Brandy Hole Lane. Also, as Barry Cunliffe explains, while we still have a far from complete picture of what Oppida looked like, it is noteworthy that while you have the significant activity that you'd associate with major settlements such as dwellings, cemeteries, a possible mint, in a Mediterranean context, these would be the result of an urban settlement being concentrated into a confined area, whereas in an oppidum like Chichester, all the elements are notably spread quite far apart. So instead, if we switch to the hills above Chichester with excellent views in all directions, the Trundle, which is also called St Roch's Hill, but no one I have ever met calls it that. It is amusing to think that when I came up here as a child and later as a teenager, the ditches just didn't register. I remember thinking it was a nice hangout point, and we used to bomb it down Chalk Pit Lane there on our bikes, which quite often led to absolute carnage, but it simply did not occur to me that the ditches up here was something to take note of, which is mental to me now. Now, its story extends way before the Iron Age. It's not really perceivable from the ground. In fact, no one discovered this before the advent of aerial photography, but within the current boundary, there was a causewayed enclosure. Now, we've mentioned these before. They are Neolithic in date. They are somewhat ceremonial, often in high places. Characterising their exact purpose is not easy, but around 2,000 years later, many did get expanded or transformed into hillforts. By the way, the name Trundle is not, in fact, so named because of the walk to get up there, but from the Old English word trindel, meaning circle. It saw use in later centuries too, when a chapel was built up there in the 1400s to pray for plague victims, and even an improvised fortress in the English Civil War. Okay, I think we just have time for a couple more quick sites. Heading further east and crossing the River Arun, despite the appearance of some hills that, certainly look very fortable to me, we don't get another clearly visible enclosure till this rather remote spot. Now, this is a comparatively small enclosure. It's actually of the Martin Down type, if you remember that. So, probably a farmstead. Excavations in 1936 revealed the presence of both a timber palisade and timber gateway, as well as the skulls of between 50 to 100 oxen. It shares the hill with something even older. If you're wondering what these are the remains of flint mines. And apologies if this is triggering anyone's trypophobia. Content warning, I guess. Far too late. Without going too far into the geology and a long way past my comfort zone, the presence of the chalk downs means this area is a great source of flint. In fact, for centuries in Sussex, it's the main stone anyone's building with, be it church towers or houses. This isn't the only place in the area with flint mining, though we're not there quite yet, so pardon us if we leave the discussion of flint for next time, because there's just one more before we wrap this one up. Heading a little further south and in sight of the coast, this is Highdown Hill. Now, the first enclosure here was in the Bronze Age, sometime around 1000 BC, but this was transformed in the early Iron Age. The 1939 dig here discovered the remnants of Bronze Age huts beneath the ramparts, so they are overlaying part of the earlier settlement. There are also 2 large post holes of the gate that originally stood in the eastern entrance. The site did get used later as a major Anglo-Saxon cemetery from around 450 AD. There were all sorts of finds from the 86 burials. There was actually a major dig there this summer just gone by the Worthing Archaeological Society, and I just missed being able to go and see it, but you can catch all the highlights on the Worthing Museum Facebook page if you just scroll down a little bit. You have to really appreciate how well situated Highdown is. I squinted and I did have to check, but not only is it in direct line of sight to Cissbury off to the east, but lucky us, we were there on a very clear day, and from the admittedly modest ramparts of Highdown, you can see clearly all the way over to the Isle of Wight to the west, round the scoop of the Sussex coast, and way over to the Seven Sisters in the east. We'll be getting there by the next episode. That is a span of around 60 miles end to end. That is ridiculous. Considering we're not even that high above sea level, that's one pretty irresistible vantage point to place yourself. However, with those glimpses beyond, we are a ways over time for this already, so we're going to wrap things up there for now. Still a lot outstanding. We've got the rest of Sussex and the line of the Downs, but also word on the late Iron Age tribes in the area by the time the classical writers are documenting southern Britain. That's all to come next time. Meanwhile, if you've been enjoying the music in the background, it's ours. We make all the music for these episodes, and you can find it on bandcamp.com. If you want to support the channel, that's the place to do it. I say, please have a flick back through the channel and watch some other episodes. We've also got the playlist, which has all of our Hillforts stuff in there, so you can watch that. And if you follow us on Blue Sky, particularly on Wednesdays, if you find the tag Hillforts Wednesday, make sure to include that S. We're all having lots of fun with that, so come and join us. Otherwise, we'll catch you very soon.